Throughout history and across many cultures from around the world, shields have been incredibly important. They're a complete game changer. If you're facing spears with something short like a sword or an axe, you're generally at a massive disadvantage until you bring shields into the equation. Shields are a very good way of cancelling out the effect of particularly long weapons because they enable you to close. The Romans made an entire military strategy out of it. But in addition to that, of course, we're living in a world where people could throw things at you or indeed shoot things at you with various types of missile weapon. So if you've got arrows, javelins, sling stones, things like this coming your way, thrown axes, knives, whatever, then clearly a shield is a good thing to have. And remember that shields don't only actively defend against things you can see, but if they're large, they can also give a passive defense. The very fact that you're carrying it, if you're carrying it on one side and advancing that way, if the enemy are over there, you are inherently protected from missiles. Most people will point out to you that shields gradually disappeared with the advent of gunpowder. But is that actually true? And is gunpowder the reason why these disappeared? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So we're going to be looking at shields. Why did shields disappear? But also, to begin with, did they disappear with the advent of gunpowder? We're going to start off with that. Fundamentally, no. Okay, so there are many reasons why shields might be laid aside in favour of other weapons. So one of the typical examples I will give is in the age of plate armour. Just grab again a sneak preview of my new armour, which we'll look at in an upcoming video. When plate armour came along, it really changed and dictated a lot of the weapon choices for the knightly classes, let's call them that, knights, men-at-arms. So the people wearing that armour, because fundamentally the armour gave such good protection that they found, for the most part, although I've shown that sometimes they did, for the most part, a lot of them stopped carrying types of hand shield because they simply didn't need it anymore. The armour was mostly proof against arrows and thrown spears and things like that. So why not have both hands free to use another weapon or pair of weapons? Example, the poleaxe, because you become a much more formidable opponent now holding a weapon like this rather than using a sword and shield. But moreover, you particularly become more effective against other armoured opponents. If everybody that you're fighting against, or at least a lot of them, are going to be wearing full plate harness, a weapon like this gives you not only greater reach, but an enormous amount more leverage and a whole bunch of tactical options and ways that you can use the weapon against armoured foes. So in that sense, in that particular case, shields became less popular for the knightly classes in the late 14th and into the 15th centuries, but they didn't disappear. They were retained for more lightly equipped troops. All the way through the 15th century, we see various type of more lightly armoured spearmen and people like this, particularly in Italy. They used still quite long shields. Almost Roman in style actually, but types of shields were still used right the way through the 15th century and indeed into the 16th century. And in fact, in the 16th century, which is the age where gunpowder really comes of age, I would say, and really starts to change the battlefield, shields were still being widely used, even though the arquebus was being used in huge numbers and field artillery on the battlefield. And in 16th and 17th century Europe, shields and armour continued to still be very, very important. But let's not only be Eurocentric about this, let's look to Asia, for example. Let's look at China or India. And here I've got a couple of 19th century, possibly 18th century in this case, Indian shields. And Indian shields were still being used in the 19th century when the British were there in the Sikh Wars and the Indian Mutiny, all this kind of stuff. The Afghans were still using shields even quite late in the 19th century. So shields were still being used in parts of Asia, and the Chinese were still using shields in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, even though in both those places firearms, both artillery, so cannons, but also handheld matchlock and in some cases flintlock firearms have been around for hundreds of years. In India and China, they'd been using guns for as long as the Europeans had, and yet in all of those places, shields were still being used. And some of you might say, well, why weren't shields still being used in, let's say, 18th century Europe? They were! And a really famous example, and I've got a special treat for you here. I'm handling it very carefully because it's currently undergoing, or beginning to undergo, restoration. An original middle 1700s, so middle of the 18th century, around sort of Culloden period, Highland Taj. So there we go. And now these were being used, obviously, in the middle of the 1700s against redcoats, as my American viewers would refer to them. So kind of British government line infantry in redcoats, admittedly, with muskets and bayonets. And these were being used even against massed ranks of muskets, somewhat like this here. This is somewhat later, this is a 19th century one, but it gives you the basic idea. So against people with very powerful muskets and bayonets, both the Highlanders of Scotland, the Indian, sort of like the Sikh, for example, warriors, Nihangs and everybody else fighting in the Punjab, using these sorts of shields, both alongside these guns and against them. And of course, if we look at China as late as the Boxer Rebellion, but also all over Africa, of course. So absolutely, shields were continuously used, not just in places like Africa and parts of Asia, Philippines and so on and so forth, but even in places where firearms were very prevalent and almost normal. For example, in Scotland or India. And remember, again, just very carefully picking that up, remember that the people using these Highland Tajes, yes, those were often coupled with a basket-hilted broadsword, but those people often had their own muskets and pistols, which they often fired off as they commenced the Highland charge. So the question is, in an age where clearly, generally, shields aren't going to protect you against bullets, why did they keep using these shields? And the answer, obviously, is because they give you a huge advantage in hand-to-hand combat. So if a person is armed with a sword or any other kind of hand weapon, they're a formidable opponent, absolutely. But if you now couple it with some form of shield, you absolutely are more formidable in close combat. And as the Highlanders demonstrated against bayonets, standard militia or even regular army troops at this time weren't given an enormous amount of training with their bayonets, and they were usually trained to use bayonets against bayonets, and they often weren't trained to go against shields. And obviously one of the great things you can do with a shield, and again we have written accounts of this happening, is you can jam your shield onto the end of the bayonet. This was absolutely done in Africa, Asia and Scotland. You can jam it onto the end of the bayonet, and your opponent, who is presenting their bayonet forwards, you can take it aside and charge him with beyond the immediate reach or kind of optimal range of their bayonet, and you can hit them with your sword or axe or whatever you happen to be armed with. So absolutely, even in the age of gunpowder, once you get into close combat, and remember with slow reloading firearms, this is always going to happen, the shield is still a huge advantage. Now, I mentioned that shields wouldn't actually physically protect you against gunfire, gunshots. However, that's not always true. And in fact, there have been some recent experiments done with reconstructions of these Highland Tajes, which it must be said are quite thick, made of hardwood, and they have a certain type of layered construction sometimes, but with the leather on front as well. And certainly if presented at a glancing angle, much like Panther tank armour, for example, you can indeed glance musket shots off them. Now, I have to remind people, of course, that black powder weapons using government-issued ammunition that wasn't always a tight fit to the bore, because remember, it's in a paper cartridge that's bitten off. These guns are, generally speaking, not certainly the bullets or the ball is not travelling at anything like the velocity that you might get out of something even like a 303 or whatever, a kind of World War I or World War II rifle. These are much slower, so black powder is a slower propellant than modern nitro, but in addition, because of the fit and the gases released around the projectile and stuff like this, they're not as efficient. So firstly, the gunshots are not as powerful as you might be accustomed to if you do modern shooting with modern firearms, pistols or rifles, but In addition to that, the battlefield conditions and everything else means that sometimes, and we also have accounts even with leather, hardened leather shields, thicker ones than this, from the Sudan, for example, in the 1880s and 1890s, of pistol bullets actually glancing off them as well. So, just briefly to say that while generally speaking a medieval shield won't stop a bullet, in some situations they could possibly, usually by glancing. So to answer the original question, did shields stop being used because of gunpowder? The answer is yes, but not exactly for the reason that you might think. So most people seem to think that shields were useless in this age and therefore they were abandoned. However, indeed, sometimes certain types of shield, and you can make a bulletproof shield, it's actually not very difficult at all. You can make bulletproof shields, and they could have made bulletproof shields. In fact, in the American Civil War in the 1860s, they did experiment with bulletproof shields. And even in World War I, they made bulletproof shields. So absolutely, you can make bulletproof shields even in the 19th century. But here's the main reason. The main reason is because a shield occupies your hand or arm, okay? And in the age of gunpowder, there's usually something better that you can be doing with that hand or arm. So yes, indeed, this is a British officer's sabre of the 19th century. So yes, indeed, there are accounts of British officers in India, occasionally, there's a couple of examples I found, using Indian shields. You could do it, okay? But the typical thing that you want to be doing with your left hand, instead of using a shield, is using one of these, okay? So if you're an officer with a sword, generally speaking, having a pistol in your offhand, and this would also go to naval sailors as well, with a cutlass and a single shot pistol. If you can use a pistol in your left hand, that's usually going to be a more effective use of your left hand rather than having a shield. Also, if you're doing something else with your left hand, where do you put the shield? You've got to wear it, you've got to carry it, so that's a nuisance. I should mention, in fact, that in the 19th century, the Indian cavalry officers did keep using their shields until around the time of the Indian Mutiny, so that there were officers carrying a sword and a shield still in the Indian army. But moreover, if you're a typical infantryman, so don't think about the Scottish Highlander here with his assortment of weapons, his shield and his broadsword and his musket and his pistols and everything else. If you're a standard line infantryman, your primary weapon is one of these, and your hands are just occupied with this. Your primary role is to stand there, to bite the cartridge, put the powder down, put the paper in the thing, get your ramrod out, ram it down, come up here, half cock, prime the pan, full cock, fire. Okay, so you've got a long, lengthy process in order to get those either volley fire, or whether you're firing just by yourself, whatever. So loading and firing is a big occupation just by itself, and moreover, when you get into close combat, obviously you've got a bayonet. Well, there's no place for a shield in that situation. So the vast majority of infantry, and this is even true of places like India with your standard sepoy. So there was a point at which they were carrying musket with a bayonet, with a tulwar sword, and with one of these shields as well. And it's a lot to carry, and at a certain point they obviously thought, well, we've got bayonets now, we're going to stop carrying the tulwar and the shield, because you can't carry everything. So there we go. So shields essentially didn't get abandoned directly because of the effect of the gunpowder weapons themselves, I would argue. They got abandoned because the operation of firearms became so good and so effective that the operation of these became paramount, and the carrying of additional hand weapons became superfluous. And equally for officers, obviously they had pistols or other things to do, and so just having a sword and using the sword both for defense and attack had to take the job of bothering to carry a shield around. But even until the late days of the 19th century, there were occasionally a few people that did discuss whether they should take up carrying shields again, and there were occasional examples of people doing it in colonial areas where they were fighting, doing a lot more hand-to-hand combat against opponents. Anyway, there we go. So that's a little overview, and also hopefully a nice look at some period shields. So remember, shields didn't disappear and didn't go out of use really until about between basically around 1900. Okay, we see loads of shields being used in Africa, fair number being used in Asia. up until 1900, and really we still see them being used in Scotland until the middle of the 1700s, and very occasionally, as I say, there were experiments with bulletproof shields after that in the 19th century and even up until World War I. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.